Who exactly are we talking about today?
So the group we've chosen to talk about is groups that have recently migrated to Australia. Before beginning, it's pretty important to define what we mean by groups that have recently migrated. So Australia is a particularly difficult country to define migration because 28.5% of our population is migrants, so born overseas. This figure doesn't really represent people that are actually migrants and struggling towards the system. So as of June 2016, the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, reported that 28.5% of Australia's population was born overseas, which is about 6.9 million. So there's a lot of immigrants in this country, and there's a bigger proportion than what a lot of people think. In the 12-month period leading up to 2016, net overseas migration reflected a gain of 182,000. So we are taking in a lot of people for our population, but at the same time we're a big land. These figures show a snapshot of where the people are born, but doesn't exactly. So many cultures have found their way in Australia, but it's impossible to define one ethnicity or culture that is particularly struggling. Poverty is a widespread issue in this country and all over the world. So the ABS defines poverty as one single adult earning less than $400 a week and a family with 2 children earning less than $840 a week. Under this description, Australia currently has 3 million citizens, just under 3 million citizens. So for the sake of my part of this exercise, to actually define who we're talking about today, we're using the ABS's description, so anyone that fits under that, and anyone that fits under the description of COLD, so culturally and linguistically diverse. Basically, the ABS has found this is the population that struggles the most with integration, just through language and cultural differences. And COLD references who migrated in the last 10 years will be our focus today.
So why do people make the change and move to Australia?
It's a good question. Immigration has seen many forms and shapes all over the world for many different reasons. People have been drawn to this place for a while now because it's very secluded. Australia's the biggest island in the world, and generally with that comes the lack of war. And post-World War II, Australia took massive numbers of European and majority British citizens, so the 10-pound bomb and things like that. Europe was incredibly war-torn in those times, and people were looking for an escape at work, and Australia advertised itself as that, and was that. In more recent times, majorly starting in the early 2000s, was a large number of people seeking asylum from war-torn countries in the Middle East, Africa and Asia.
So you spoke before about the integration being difficult. What makes it so difficult?
So these aspects of integration, it's varies between every person's life. Everyone has different issues that they face when they move to a different country. The language being the first one, but we find that a lot of children born to the parents of immigrants still suffer the same issues that their parents do. If their parents have been unable to integrate into the society, find work, that can generally carry on through generations. So parents that face these issues they gain the lifestyle that is within poverty, and children growing up in that can continue on this sort of trend. With the jobs not out there, they are relying on welfare, and this can just pass on through generations. It's just quite an evil cycle. It's incredibly difficult. No one that's moved countries understands really the cultural differences, behaviours. Every country has different beliefs and values. Some of these just don't carry on through to the Australian lifestyle, and they just don't fit in. So some of the other issues we found with just getting work itself, interview stereotypes are really placed on these Asian and Middle Eastern names compared to the common Anglo-Celtic and Anglo-Saxon names. The SBS News released a report from the Scanlon report. It was one of the biggest surveys of Australia today in the cultural issues, and one of the unnamed sources in that document, she went unnamed, but this is just some of the quotes she had through her integration struggles, and it really paints a picture on how people struggle today. So she basically said, when you go to Vodafone to get a plan, they ask you for your address, but you don't have an address. When you go to rent a property, they ask you for rent history, but you don't have any. They ask you for a pay slip, you don't have a job. You apply for jobs, but they won't give you any job because you don't have any local experience and you can't get a degree. The issues just keep on stemming through because another one that comes forward is the technologies. Access to the internet is a very common thing in first world countries. We take it for granted. We use it every day, and it's a massive part of our lives. But and it's very affordable for anyone with a stable job in this country. But if you can't find this work and if you're living on welfare, it's not exactly affordable. getting access to a smartphone is honestly, it is essential in today's lifestyle. Welfare payments, job opportunities, job interviews, and even large portions of people's work are conducted on the internet. And without a smartphone or computer, it's just simply not possible. So further on from that, 20% of those arriving on humanitarian visas and 50% of those arriving as asylum seekers in the same period still have no reported work. The notable thing from this is that 90% of them rated as very happy and satisfied with their life now. Coming from a country like that, a third world country where food violence are very food shortages and violence are very prevalent, you can see why these people would be incredibly happy living in Australia, where the crime rate is low and food is abundant. They are in the best conditions, but it is much better than where they're from generally. The workplace today, as we all know, is really becoming technology focused. Technology is taking many jobs. For instance, the car industry in Australia has completely collapsed because it's just been taken over by robots, and it's really making unskilled jobs much less prevalent, which really hurts immigrants because as an unskilled worker coming to a country, you generally want to find an unskilled job, and they're just simply not out there anymore. I want to continue this discussion into the social security benefit they receive regarding its adequacy in alleviating poverty. And so I just really quickly want to discuss the social security benefits these people receive and how adequate it is in relieving the poverty. The ABS reports that an immigrant coming from overseas receives $316 on the New Start allowance, which is the maximum per week, and the poverty line is at $400 a week, and it's an obvious indicator that we're not helping these people's cases. The jobs aren't there, technology is taking it over, and when you're receiving less money than the poverty line itself, these people just aren't able to live with all the expenses that living in Australia requires today. Further on from this, it's become very large in Australia today that a parent's income and lifestyle and work choices have a big influence on where we go with ourselves. I know for myself, the connections I've made within my future studies and what I'll be doing after university have come from my parents and where I'll probably work after university. For someone to come to this country without the backing of a parent or someone they've worked for previously, it makes it incredibly difficult to get a job, and it's just an incredibly vicious cycle for these people. I'll now pass it on to Josiah to talk about the relative quantitative data and research behind these immigrants moving to the country.
How many Australians are considered immigrants?
Well, Australia prides itself on being a multicultural society, but poverty is actually a bigger issue for some cultures than others, and that includes immigrants. So according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, their 2016 census, approximately 6.16 million people, or 26% of Australians, were born overseas, which includes 907,000 from England, 518,000 from New Zealand, 509,000 from China, and 455,000 from India. And that's all highlighted in the graph on your screen now.
What proportion of immigrants are considered below the poverty line?
Well, for that question, first we have to define what is meant by the poverty line. For this discussion, the poverty line will be the point below which is considered living in poverty. Now that's going to be taken from the 50% median income of all Australians. We're defining the poverty line as earning below $350 per week in Australia, compared to a poverty line in Africa, which would be no food, no shelter. So that has to be a clear definition of what we mean by poverty line. Big product per capita, Australia is in the top 3 according to the International Monetary Fund. KPMG partner Bernard Salt said the Norwegians were the richest in the world, with an average of $90,000 US per man, woman or child, followed by the Swiss and then Australians after them. So our poverty line may be comparably higher to other nations around the world. According to the 2014 ACOS Poverty Report, adults born in countries where English isn't the main language that's spoken, they face a much higher risk of poverty than those born in Australia, and that's highlighted in the graph here. You can see that the adults born overseas face a much higher risk of poverty compared to those who are born in Australia at 11.6%, or in an English-speaking country at 11.4%. Also from the 2014 poverty report, the profile of poverty graph shows that 29.1% of adults living in households that are below the 60% poverty line are from a non-English speaking country. So both those graphs tie into each other. Actually, many reasons for these statistics being so high. One may be the language barrier and its consequential limitations in the workplace. An employer is always someone who is able to communicate better than another candidate. It also reduces the quality of work that the immigrants are able to apply for. More prestigious roles may have a requirement to be fluent in English, or possibly at the very least have some sort of English equivalent qualification, such as English as a second language. Many immigrants are reduced to working labourers jobs such as processing, warehousing or unskilled manual labour, all of which have pay rates that don't reach the poverty line in Australia. Some overseas qualifications aren't even recognised in Australia, which causes some immigrants to choose between either going back to school or just coping with the low-paying jobs, both of which put a strain on their financial situation, which further increases their poverty status. If an immigrant were to choose to go back to school, they can't claim the HECS benefit, meaning they have to pay for university upfront, which also isn't possible due to their already low income.
Australian society as a whole.
Well, Macquarie Bank analyst Rory Robertson stated that Australia has an above average immigration rate with a high propensity to cluster in capital cities. So a lot of our population is in the capital cities along the coastline. And that then exacerbates housing affordability, so that affects everyone. This further pushes immigrants to earn more money as housing is expensive, and those that don't meet the financial requirements to sustain a livable home may have to make other sacrifices to make ends meet. So they may have to give up clothing for a month or electricity. That's an extreme case, but it has happened. If someone from another country has a desire to live in or near a capital city, they have to be prepared to pay a premium price to upkeep their living standards. And a high proportion of them don't have the funds required to do so, as seen in the previous statistics. This then causes the poverty rate of the country as a whole to increase. Another effect poverty in immigrants has on society is the fact that if they're considered poor, they can't become a contributing member of society as readily as someone who is more financially stable. Then they become dependent on the benefit systems and develop into a burden, essentially.
Statistics.
Well, there's examples every day of immigrants being mistreated because of their immigration status, and that leads to them living in poverty. Some of these people rely solely on the government benefits to survive. One example is from the Holy Apostolic and Catholic Church of the East. They gave the following case examples. So there was a man who was 65 years old, that's just retirement age, and he had been living and working in Australia for 6 years before then. He was no longer able to work because of his age. He's an Australian citizen and he can vote the elections, but he will not be entitled to the old age pension because he has not completed 10 years residence in Australia. So that's just one example of mistreatment of immigrants based on their immigration status. There was also the case of a young man who was 32 years old and he was suffering from an acute case of advanced cancer. A doctor referred to him as a terminal case, so he was going to die very soon. Again, he was also an Australian citizen, and he was told for all intents and purposes, you are an Australian citizen, but he was not entitled to the invalid pension. He was not entitled to the invalid pension because he had not completed 5 years of residence in Australia. So these are just two examples of two people who had separate lifestyles and they still tie into these statistics.
Armin.
Hey man, how are you?
Good mate. What are you up to here?
Oh,
You were doing some really,
some
was
noughts and
doing
crosses.
some good work here, aren't we?
Some noughts and crosses.
Anyways, look, mate, I've got some questions for you today.
Sure,
So if you just answer it for us, that'd be awesome.
of course,
Just on the top of your head, you know, like whatever you got.
of course.
So, do refugees and immigrants experience hardship, and if so, in what ways?
Worldwide, poverty is a big problem in the world. It results in thousands of people dying each year. Poverty is an issue that needs to be addressed by everyone. If this issue is overlooked, the people living on the streets and the amount of death is going to increase as years go on. Our presentation today is to inform people about poverty among refugees and immigrants, the cause and effects it has on people. I mean, for those of us who actually haven't experienced or witnessed the difficulties in which these groups of people face, it's quite hard to understand. I think we need to remember that there's been limited research on the poverty rates of immigrants and absolutely no research on poverty of refugees. Refugees are often fleeing areas of war, persecution, and economic instability, and few actually return to their homeland. Like all immigrants, they seek a better life. For example, in the United States, refugees are admitted for an entirely different process than economic immigrants. While most immigrants must demonstrate an ability to support themselves or have a permanent resident or sponsor who will provide support, refugees are largely exempt from this requirement. In contrast, refugees arrive with less preparation, weaker English language skills, weaker informal networks, and few, if any, assets.
Thanks, Armin. Okay, you've answered that question extremely well. Thank you, Armin. We've got another question for you now, mate. What is the main explanation for causes of poverty?
Sure. We examine the likelihood that two types of households, refugees and immigrants, are below the poverty line. Human capital and labour demand are the main explanations for poverty between these two groups. In order to find the immigrant and refugees' effects, we hold constant the typical variables well known to be highly correlated with earnings and poverty, such as education, sex, race, ethnicity, and number of children in the family. While most immigrants must demonstrate an ability to support themselves or have a permanent resident or sponsor who will provide support, refugees are largely exempt from this requirement. As we cannot determine why poverty rates differ across groups, we can say that the immigrant-refugee effects we report are not due to differences in these variables. We found that while refugees are more likely to be poor, controlling demographic effects, the result is largely due to response to local unemployment rate. Indeed, at low enough employment rate, refugees are actually less likely to be more poor than immigrants. However, when unemployment rate rises, refugees move into poverty at a significantly faster rate than immigrants. At levels of unemployment rate, there appears to be little difference in poverty rates between refugees and immigrants. However, the response to unemployment indicates that in times of recession, refugees will fare worse. This may be due to concentration of refugees in industries, with higher cyclical variation in unemployment. We also find that refugee poverty rates, while starting much higher, fall more rapidly with time than other immigrants. Importantly, these differences also appear to differ by pre- and post-transfer income measures. Suggestion that different regions are better at filling a poverty gap for immigrants than refugees.
Thank you. Alright, Armin, you're answering these questions exceptionally well. You don't want to break or anything. You're okay, right?
I'm fine.
I've got one more question for you, mate. You sure you don't need a tea break or anything like that?
Nah, just one more question. I'll summarize what I've explained.
Okay, awesome, sweet. Alright, basically, the last question is the concept of poverty an individual or structural issue?
That's a very good question, actually. There are many competing theories when discussing poverty rates for immigrants and refugees. The first theory is that poverty is an individual phenomenon. People are in poverty because they are lazy, uneducated, ignorant, or otherwise inferior in some manner. If this theory were true, we could whip poverty by helping 1 in 100 refugee immigrants to figure things out and actually climb out of poverty. The second explanation is that it's a structural phenomenon. On this view, refugees and immigrants are in poverty because they find themselves in holes in the economic system that deliver inadequate income. They inevitably find themselves in that hole because it is a persistent defect in the economic structure. It follows from this impoverished people are not the same people every year. It follows further that the only way to reduce poverty is to alter the economic system, reduce the number of low-income holes, and to provide immigrants and refugees an opportunity to seek a successful life. By informing people with all this information, I'd like to see them taking action towers to this issue. To help stop poverty, we must help each other in other ways we can. Poverty is a deadly issue that's killing our population slowly. In my individual opinion, all those people that are now living in poor conditions should not be living like this. If there's people who could do something to help by using their money to make sure that these people have a place to live and food for their kids, and most importantly, a successful future.
Awesome. Thank you, Armin. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. Thank you for answering our questions. Have a good one, mate.
The experiences and impacts of poverty on immigrants and refugees.
Based on a variety of research conducted on the issues faced by immigrants, research shows that there are a number of experiences lived by immigrants and refugees that have an impact on both their socio-economic status and their exposure to poverty. Immigrants and refugees face many difficulties while living in Australia. They are more likely to experience poverty because of their inability to find employment due to several reasons. Newcomers often face language barriers, which is a significant issue for refugees, because they are unable to communicate with people, especially in work settings, health facilities, and general settings. This issue impacts their day-to-day lives because their inability to speak the language of the country they're living in causes social isolation, which then can lead to issues such as behaviors outside the social norm. Therefore, the constant medical attention that they need makes it difficult for them to maintain a job or even get a job. The inability to find consistent employment further increases the likelihood of being in poverty, which then makes them prone to suffering from low socioeconomic status. Issues such as racism is a day-to-day experience for many immigrants and refugees. Due to the rates of racism in society, immigrants do not have the same opportunities when it comes to gaining employment. Fluency in the English language is key when it comes to seeking employment, which then makes it difficult for immigrants and refugees to find jobs when they do not speak English very well. Also, in many cases, this racism deprives them from development and educational opportunities. The discrimination in accessing employment or even gaining development and educational knowledge solely occurs based on ethnicity, cultural background. This is a direct link to the increased likelihood of poverty amongst immigrants and refugees because they are from non-English speaking backgrounds and have different cultures and customs to the ones in Australia. Therefore, the racism immigrants and refugees face is a contributing factor to poverty because they are subjected to racism due to factors beyond their control. This impacts the individual because racism and unemployment creates social isolation, which then makes the individual gain attitudes and behaviors that are outside the social norm. According to an article written by Janet Taylor in the Migration Act, an issue that immigrants experience while living in a land foreign to theirs is that they are prone to a vast amount of social exclusion because of poverty. Social exclusion is context-specific. It is a form of complex inequality which is identified as what occurs when individuals or regions suffer from combined and linked issues such as unemployment, poor skills, low income, poor housing, high crime environment, bad health, and family breakdowns. It is a multi-dimensional process that at times involves the lack of or the denial of necessary resources, goods and services, or rights that cause the inability to take part of regular activities and form regular relationships that may be available to the majority of society, whether it be in a political, economic, social, or cultural aspect. Based on findings in academic literature, the definition of poverty naturally adopted under the qualitative approach involves a broader understanding of poverty and deprivation than the definition of poverty in regards to the one of the quantitative approach. In relation to the qualitative approach, it describes poverty as to capture the processes and the interactions between social, cultural, political, and economic factors. matters. It involves a variety of factors that highlight the importance of highlights the importance of poverty using qualitative data, which includes vulnerability, isolation, powerlessness, survival instincts, personal dignity, security, self-respect, basic needs, and ownership of assets. There is an immense importance in this method because it allows for an interactive internal and external process. This method provides aspects such as vulnerability, the lack of dignity and autonomy to be considered, which helps accumulate information about people who suffer from poverty in a direct way rather than from a third person's point of view. Drawing from lived experiences creates accuracy and depth in research because individuals are more likely to talk freely in conversation form rather than they would in a staged and planned environment. It allows for follow-up questions and non-verbal responses such as body language to be utilized. The qualitative approach has the ability to measure the broader spokes of poverty. However, the most important aspect of this approach is that it helps the individual's community to analyze their own issues in regards to poverty.